Jacksonville was once the film Mecca of the country, home to more than 30 movie studios and sometimes called America's first Hollywood. That rich history is excavated in the latest installment of Bygone Jax, our Unsung History, which is a WJCT podcast. Joining me to talk about it is Jennifer Gray. She is the Public Services Coordinator for the Libraries of the Florida State College at Jacksonville. Hi, Jennifer. Welcome back.
Thank you. Good morning.
Bo Harris, longtime chief photographer at a couple of local television stations, also a writer and director of a local film production company called Bo Filmworks. Hey, Bo.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Nice to see you. Also joining us on the line, Brendan Rivers, formerly of WJCT's Adapt, but now host and producer of the Bygone Jax podcast. Hey, Brendan. Good morning.
Good morning, Ann. Thanks for having me.
So, Jennifer, this series is about the heyday of filmmaking in Jacksonville. There was a period where there was more than 300 films in a period of about 10 years, and then it kind of all went away, or not all, but that era certainly came to an end. This is the third topic that you've tackled in Bygone Jax. How did you select this in particular, the movie history of Jacksonville?
Well, most of the work from Bygone Jacksonville is a sort of offshoot of research that I did with my faculty partner, Dr. Scott Matthews, for the History of Jacksonville course at FSCJ. And one of the things that we get to touch on very briefly in that course is the silent film history of Jacksonville. But it's only a 15-week course. You can't talk about everything. And we found so much fun stuff that I was desperate for a place for it to find a home. And I was like, hey, you know what people always like to hear about? Silent film history in Jacksonville. And that's kind of the idea here. Also, it's relatively speaking, a lighter topic for the Jacksonville history. It's not quite as fraught as some other topics we could be dealing with. And I thought it would be a nice endpoint because it also highlights some of the women who get to work here. And it just all coalesced in a good idea there.
And Bygone Jax previously has focused on Civil War history here in Jacksonville. It's focused on the history of the Timucua Indians who inhabited this region for thousands of years. And it does aim to find lesser known stories. So whereas people may be familiar, a lot of people are with Norman Studios in Arlington, which is really the only physical representation of that film history that remains. This is a whole other area that I had not heard about one bit until I listened to the podcast.
That's fantastic. That's exactly what we were aiming for. So I'm really glad to hear that. And yeah, Calum is mentioned usually because it was the first film company to kind of base itself here, at least over the winters, usually when it started. But most people don't really talk about it. You hear the name and then it kind of falls off, and then you hear Norman Studios and then it's sort of like yada, yada, everything ended, goodbye. But there was a very, very brief stretch, about 9 years, when Calum was a real force here in the local area. And we use it as a lens to look at sort of the broader scope of Jacksonville's film history trajectory, which started very brightly and then sort of petered out for a variety of different reasons.
I want to bring in Bo Harris, though, because we're talking about old history of film, but you are very much a current filmmaker working in Jacksonville. You just won a big award. First of all, tell us what the recent recognition was and for which film of yours that you recently produced.
Well, actually, I just recently signed a distribution deal for my latest film called A Mother's Hope. And by attending a lot of different film festivals, you were able to make connections to these resources, send your film out, and get selected. And so we're really excited about that.
You were a former colleague of mine, my chief photographer at First Coast News, but you've also worked at Action News. And you've always done a million things on this side, as I remember. Well, this is your passion, though, making films. Do you feel part of the history of film in Jacksonville, speaking broadly, or do you just feel like you're doing your work in your lane and kind of making the films that you love?
It's weird that you bring that up because I do kind of feel like I'm just in my lane making my films but there is a connection. You kind of feel that connection now that when you hear the history, and then just to identify you becoming a part of that history because we're in Jacksonville.
Right. That's deep, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you are kind of part of this long history. Brendan, I want to talk to you about a couple of really cool discoveries that the podcast brings out. One is that this may have been the place where sequels were invented, that the studios, Calum Studios, that the podcast focuses on so much, they kind of were the first to create this series about a female spy. They're also responsible somewhat for the creation of the idea of a movie star. Tell us about some of those elements of the podcast?
Well, I mean, that's kind of one of the cool things about this whole project, and we can kind of have similar discoveries with previous seasons. There are so many elements of Jacksonville history that aren't widely known, but that played like really major roles in sort of a broader historical context. And yeah, you point out a couple of things, but Caleb was responsible for so many kind of like hallmark things in the film industry today. They helped kind of birth the age of movie stars by giving credit to actors. They were kind of involved in this legal struggle that kind of helped shape our modern concept of copyright law. They wrote some of the first music that was ever written for movies. They kind of drove this trend of Civil War movies that eventually led to the birth of a nation. There's just like all these huge things that happened right here in Jacksonville that really shaped this industry that everybody pays such close attention to now.
Jennifer, I thought it was really funny that they created these massive posters of the talent that was in these films. And before that, they were almost never recognized by name or in any way celebrated by the film studios themselves.
That's right. So very early in film history, what you have to remember is that movies they were not where you wanted to appear as an actor. Like you wanted to sort of quietly go get paid for doing a movie, and then you wanted to go back to do, the theater and be respected, right? So it was kind of like a good thing for the actors for a while because it was the sort of trashy sideline that you did to make a buck. And so nobody got credited and everybody was fine with that. And I think part of the argument for that was also because they were silent films, like your performance wasn't being heard, right? So what was the whole point of it anyway? And then there was a sort of transition as movies got more popular, where Calum decided to take a page from theatrical posters, which already did exist. So this was a thing that happened in the theater where people, you had your photos of your actors that were posted in the theatrical lobby or whatever, and they just ported that over to movies. And we're like, you know what we think people would want? We think people want to know who the hot people in this film are. And they provided that service.
And they did. And the movie theater said that there really was a demand for this, a
Yep.
craving for knowing more about these stars.
It's almost like people like movie stars.
Isn't it crazy? There was a time that people didn't believe that was even a thing. One of the things that this podcast looks at, Jennifer, is the way that this studio, Calum, created a different kind of film when it came to war stories. Tell us about how the stories that they decided to tell about the Civil War changed perspectives and the story that was basically told about that conflict.
Okay. So when Calum first came down here, they did a variety of different things. They were very scrappy. They threw a bunch of stuff against the wall to see what worked. And as they were sort of cycling through, one of the things that they found worked was doing Civil War stories from the point of view of the South. Now, war dramas were not new by any stretch of the imagination. You had about 50 years worth of theater doing them. There were a couple of movies that had existed previously. In fact, Calum, before they came down here, had done a movie called The Days of 61, which is maybe the first Civil War film ever made. It's tough to tell in film history sometimes what was first and what wasn't. But they had an idea based on maybe some letters to the editor in film magazines that the South would be very receptive to having war stories told from the Confederate perspective. And so they tried it out. It was a hit. And then they kept doing it. They realized that this was a bankable commodity, and they were sort of mostly the only ones in that lane for a while. So they did several years worth of Confederate war films.
And boy, did it have an impact. I mean, we talk about the fact that it, possibly was part of the trajectory that led to Birth of the Nation. That, of course, being, a much reviled racist film, but also very influential for its time, a really long feature film also for its time, told with a focus on the myth of the Confederacy, the lost cause.
Well, I should say D.W. Griffith was probably going to D.W. Griffith no matter what Calum did. He was already working at this time. In fact, there's a story that Jean Gontier, who is the primary scriptwriter for Calum and the lead actress while she's down here, she tells a story in her memoir that she claims to have gotten D.W. Griffith started when she was actually working at a different film company, and that she gave him his break as a director. And so she sort of claims him. So he was already in the mix, but I definitely think that they made this kind of story more popular. You also have to remember that we're talking about a time when they would have been coming up on an anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the Civil War. So this was sort of in the zeitgeist, and people were just in the mood for these kind of things.
Bo Harris, the films that you make are their own niche. They are not political films,
No.
particularly. They're human stories, and they're generally uplifting stories. Do you think about what your audience wants when you're making a film, or are you thinking about making a statement of some kind, or are you just finding a story that speaks to your heart and trying to tell it?
More so lived experience, trying to find a story that speaks to my heart, basically. And you can go through a lot of different turns and trying to deliver a message to people, and you also take in maybe embed teaching moments into different stories, just to not to have the answer, but just to have an opportunity for people to think about their own responses or their own life experiences.
As a news photographer, you went to many scenes of, heartbreak, of tragedy, also some very inspirational stories that you were able to tell. Do you draw on those experiences when you're writing a film?
Absolutely. A mother's hope basically deals with um, a mom trying to answer or be the solution for everything going on in her family, not drawing on the resources that are presented, to her, but she's trying to solve everything and realize that she can't.
Yeah. Where is that film available for people? I know you were saying that it's at film festivals.
Well, right now, okay, after we signed the distribution deal, so that I'm waiting for the company to tell me what platforms that we will be on. So we're in that middle gap.
To date, people have only been able to watch it, though, at film festivals. And how has the reception been?
Well, actually, we actually also premiered it in Jacksonville back in the end of February, and it was overwhelming. People loved it. Responses on Facebook and different social media platforms, and so now I'm just sitting in the theater and listening to people's responses is actually amazing. Some things that you wrote in that you think that are not supposed to be funny, people are laughing at, and
In
vice
a good
versa.
way,
In a
or
good way, yeah, in a good way. You're like, oh, I never thought about that, but yeah, that's funny.
are they local actors that you're using?
Some are. We've had actors as far away as Texas. My main actors came out of Atlanta, and then having to come to Jacksonville, and then you got to spend the resources to have them a place to stay, feed them, and all that. So it can be very expensive, also.
Brendan, you're currently in Atlanta. You used to be here in Jacksonville. You're producing podcasts up there as well, for that market. What is it that you look for when you're putting together a podcast like this in terms of content, in terms of moments, in terms of elements to keep listeners engaged?
Uh, well, first, I want to say that this whole podcast could not have happened without Jennifer and her colleagues and all the incredible research they did. It's really so much stuff that they were able to find. And that was really the start of all of it. And she found so many like great primary sources that we were able to incorporate into the show. And if listeners are familiar with the NPR podcast Throughline, I was kind of looking to that as sort of inspiration for the structure for this show. So we had a lot of great volunteers, friends and coworkers and people we knew throughout Jacksonville who volunteered their time to kind of voice some of these primary sources. And then we kind of looked for what we thought could be cool, like audio scenes that we could portray in the podcast. So like in these episodes, there is like a scene of Calum actors rescuing people who were like drowning in the water as they were shooting a scene. I was able to just kind of find some cool audio that we could use to kind of make listeners sort of hear that scene and feel like they were there when it was happening. One of Jennifer's coworkers was generous enough to record herself playing piano. We found some piano scores for music that was actually used in some Calum films. So most of the music you hear in these episodes were actually pieces of music that you would have heard if you went to go see a Calum film at the time. So Jennifer was really able to turn up some really great resources that we were able to incorporate into the podcast that I think really helps kind of transport listeners back in time and give as accurate a picture as we could of what was happening.
We should say, Jennifer, this really is kind of a passion project of yours. I mean, you find these histories and then you convert them into a podcast to be able to share some of these unknown stories or lesser known stories. How did the film industry shape Jacksonville at the time? I mean, there was a mayor who was very supportive for a while, but the kind of bohemian nature of the filmmakers and the crews eventually chafed with the more conservative elements of Jacksonville.
Yeah, so that's actually a really open question for me that I haven't been able to settle. So the general line that you hear is, filmmaking kind of got out of hand in the city of Jacksonville. They're running amok in the streets. They're, smashing buildings. They're running cars off the edges of piers. Oh my God, they're filming on Sunday. How dare they? Hail surprise. And all of that. And then it'll sort of like culminates in the loss of the mayoralty by Jet Bowden to John Martin in 1917. And then it just like supposedly the filmmakers all apparently either drop dead or disappear in a puff of smoke, and it's just all over, right? And as we were working on this story, we found that it seemed to be a lot more complicated than that, right? So for Calum in particular, what you were looking at is, sure, there was some of that, change in political vibe, but Calum was pretty much done by the time that John Martin took the office. So you can't blame it all on his disapproval of the film community. Instead, you're looking at things like, the change in the markets caused by World War I, like lack of supplies or closure of markets abroad for selling your films. You're looking at different things like the collapse of the Edison Trust, which Calum was a part of. So they were a part of this big sort of monopolistic practice that was really benefiting them monetarily. And then that sort of like fizzled out in 1915. And so suddenly they're on their own. And after that, you start seeing the executives pop up in interviews being like, oh, well, the movie making business, it used to be profitable, and now we're not making any money. It's almost like when you have a monopoly, you do better than other people. So things like that happened. And then there was also like sort of a recession going on in Jacksonville too. And banks were a little bit more unlikely to loan money. And then there were, the people locally had sort of like caught on to the idea that they could make a buck off the film companies. So they used to like rent furniture for sets and things. And they're like, oh, wait, hold on. You dinged a chair leg. We're going to charge you for this entire living room set. So a lot of different changes.
There are so many considerations that go into making a film, Bo, as you well know. In terms of incentives, the state has been, looking at, the city has been trying to increase incentives for local filmmaking. How much does that affect your production, your work? Are you able to take advantage of any of those? Do you rely on a better, reception for filmmaking in Florida by the powers that be?
Well, the issue with a lot of filmmakers is that they're not aware of how it can impact them. And so they don't seek out, well, what can I do here? Can I cut costs by doing this? I actually didn't use any parts of any incentives until the very end, when I had to rent, like I rented a gym to shoot one of our closing scenes in. And that's kind of like my extent with it. Had I known in advance, I could have taken more advantage of what opportunities that were there. So my calls to any filmmaker today is to go find out how you can benefit.
Well, the new edition segment of Bygone Jax dropped today. You can find it on your favorite podcast platform and, of course, at WJCT.org.